20th of October. Many of you have been getting in touch with myself and also Norrie Hunter about the issue of what's happening with the United Nations. Now, many of you will be aware that Salvo, Liberation Scotland, have been in Geneva actually presenting at least some preliminary background information to the United Nations about the case for Scotland to be reclassified not as being in a voluntary union, i.e. of the United Kingdom, but actually as a colony, and explaining how Scotland became colonised in the first place and presenting historical documents, facts, in other words, not disputed by the United Kingdom, which support that status. Now, before we get into this completely, let me just bring something to your attention. The legal firm which was representing Scotland at the UN, and this is an expert legal firm which deals with matters of international law at the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Courts, and also at the UN. They have pointed out that when evidence was presented to the UN that support for independence amongst the population of Scotland was generally at around or even slightly more than 60%. The members of the UN were actually shocked. They didn't realise that the people of Scotland, in a majority, were actually in favour of liberation, in favour of becoming independent. They were even more shocked to discover that the statistics for support for independence also indicated that young people, and I'm guessing those are people under the age of, say, 25, but I'll be corrected, I'm sure, by somebody who knows the definition of young people, that young people in Scotland are by far the biggest demographic in favour of independence. It's 75% in favour. Now, both of these things actually shocked the UN. They had no idea that the strength of support in Scotland was this high. Now, that, I think, explains a lot. For the last 80 years, the United Nations has been under the impression, because the UK said so, that Scotland was a voluntary partner in a union which it wanted to join. It wasn't forced, it wasn't coerced, etc. And yet the history doesn't support that. What's said about the union by the union itself, by England, isn't actually true, because although they promised that Scotland would be in a voluntary union and that we could leave it at any time, we can't. We have to ask permission of England to have a vote on it first of all, and even if we do vote on it, the referendum that we have been given in the past in 2014 was only advisory. It was not binding, it had no legal force in law, and even had we won that referendum back in 2014, it's perfectly possible for the United Kingdom to have said no, there wasn't sufficient support, and it was only advisory, and they've taken it under advisement and decided not to allow Scotland to become independent. So how has the situation changed? Well, you'll know that Salvo and Liberation Scotland have been working away, putting together a dossier of information for the United Nations. Now, everybody's wondering what stage this is at, because it seems to be moving very slowly. Now, first of all, the initial request, in other words, the warning that we were going to make this approach to the UN, was issued some months ago, amid some fanfare, I have to say, with the preliminary data being passed over to the UN for its consideration through several committees. Now, I am not certain exactly which order these committees come in, but so far as I can recall, the first committee is known as the C4 committee because it has 4 member states representatives on it. And if they like the look of this proposal to actually submit evidence, then they pass it to another committee called the C24 committee, which, according to Craig Murray in his recent interviews, contains 24 top diplomats from, well, 24 UN nation states, and some of them, some of the biggest ones, including, I believe, France and Germany, amongst others. So, having passed that stage, when it goes to the C24 committee, they will then debate it and decide whether it should go for wider debate to the General Assembly of the United Nations, in which all member states can discuss and debate and vote on whether this process should go forward to the next stage. Now, while that's happening, Salvo and Liberation Scotland are preparing a much more detailed document. Now, this is in a format, it has to be couched in legal terminology, but it's in a format in which the history of Scotland's union with England is laid out in terms of facts and a timeline, and how that actual reality of us joining the union and being in the union for all these many centuries has actually manifested itself, as opposed to what England has told the UN has actually happened. And so they can then compare the reality of the history with the fiction that's being presented by the United Kingdom to the UN. Now, assuming that that goes well, the UN General Assembly can then decide Scotland could be reclassified as a non-self-governing territory. Now, you might be thinking, okay, it's the UN. Doesn't the UK have a veto over everything at the UN General Assembly? Well, not this, apparently. Apparently, this type of issue, where countries are reclassified as having been colonised and being appropriate and having gone through the appropriate stages and having the appropriate requisite qualifications to be decolonised, would then automatically be right for decolonisation, and it would go to a vote of all the General Assembly. And the UK could not veto the decision. They could not say, we have a veto, we're not going to stand for this, it's not going to happen. It can't do anything about it. And because of that, there is a very good chance that this will succeed. But what does it mean once it does succeed? What does it mean if we are reclassified as a non-self-governing territory? Non-self-governing territories, and there are many of them, we would be added to a list. Now, this list at the moment is like a queue of people being processed through the system. And that system obviously has people in the queue in front of us who are at, shall we say, later stages or more advanced stages in the process than we are. Some of them have already been officially said to have been decolonised. If I remember correctly, the Turks and Caicos Islands were in this group, and they had been colonised by the UK. There's Diego Garcia, another island, I believe, in the Caribbean, which had a military base on it established by the US during World War II. Apparently that is also officially to be decolonised. And so all of these things are being decided. Now, the next question I'm often asked is, but the United Nations doesn't really have any teeth. Look at Gaza, for example. Look at what's happening between Israel and Hamas. And the UN seemed powerless to stop that bombing campaign in Gaza and the destruction of buildings and the killing of civilians. It seemed powerless to stop that. And to be fair, this is true. Countries in the UN did not take action. They didn't come out against this and put a stop to it. It was a case of many countries have simply turned a blind eye to it. And that has, to a large extent, destroyed people's faith in the UN. And you can't, spin this in a positive way. It's not good news. However, the UN is ripe for reform. It needs reform. It needs to be tightened up. America, the United States, used to be the UN's most powerful gatekeeper, and often was the country which would send in troops to stop any kind of disputes from escalating into violence. And there were often peacekeepers sent from the UN in areas of strife, basically to police the peace and to ensure that the rebuilding of these small nations went ahead smoothly. Now, Scotland isn't in this category, obviously. We're a peaceful country. Even the United Kingdom, largely in its own borders, is a peaceful state. I'm not going to call it a country. And so we don't face the same immediate threats as many small nations do. However, having our classification changed from being in a voluntary, in inverted commas, union, which we know is not true, because Scotland was coerced, it was bribed, and it was threatened with military action if it didn't join the Union in 1707. The fact is that having that classification changed changes what we, the people of Scotland, can then do to free ourselves from the Union. Norrie Hunter and I have looked at the situation from out with the prism of domestic politics. We have basically removed our view from the political microcosm of Holyrood, which is essentially a small puppet parliament set up by the UK to ensure that independence couldn't happen, because its voting system is carefully gerrymandered and engineered to prevent a majority for independence from occurring. Now, we all know that Alex Salmond very famously broke that system in 2011, and we went on to have a referendum in 2014 because David Cameron thought that we would lose, because support for independence back then was only around the 30% mark. I think it was about 38%. Cameron was pretty confident that we would basically lose it hands down. And I think United Kingdom got a massive shock when just a few days before the referendum took place on the 18th of September 2014, the support for independence reached the magic 50%. In fact, it briefly went to 51% before the now notorious vow was issued on the front pages of the Daily Record, something which basically undermined people's confidence in Scotland's ability to survive through independence, because there were all sorts of threats implied in the vow, and there were all sorts of wonderful promises made in the vow, which since the vote went against independence have never been delivered. In fact, everything that they promised not only hasn't happened, but the reverse has happened. We were told that if we voted no to independence, we would be safe in the EU. And virtually as soon as that vote was in and we had lost that referendum, we were taken out of the EU. Almost immediately. It was that rapid. 2016, we're out of the EU, and suddenly everything went wrong. Scottish farmers lost all of their I would say all of their assistance packages from the EU, which allowed them to farm on very marginal land and allowed families to continue the traditions of farming and crofting in Highland Scotland, despite the fact that commercial farms in the lowlands, which produce huge acreages of food, were competing against them in a very skewed market. Now, that all of that kind of assistance disappeared overnight, something which we were told wasn't going to happen because we were going to be safe in the UN. Safe in the EU, and yet we're not. So we know that Scotland is not in a voluntary union. We also know that none of the promises made if we voted no have ever come to fruition. Nothing that was promised has happened. The reverse has happened. We've been further impoverished over the intervening years between 2016 and now. We've had 9 years of managed but actually quite steep decline. And if you're a young person looking for a job in Scotland at the moment, you're probably going to have to migrate elsewhere to find one, especially if you're a university graduate with a degree which you were hoping would lead to a well-paid scientific, engineering, or other type of high-level job. You're just not going to get them in Scotland because they don't exist. So all of that having been said, where are we at the moment? Well, if the next phase of Salvo and Liberation Scotland's plan is successful, we move from the C4 committee to the C24 committee, where finally all of the documents, all of the historical texts, all of the legal framed requests for a change of status are finally examined and go to the C24 committee for a final recommendation to decolonise, and that then goes to the floor of the UN Assembly for a vote. Assuming that goes well, in the next few years we will be able to take action ourselves, and we won't need to rely on politicians. We won't need to rely on Holyrood to do this, nor will we have to elect MPs to Westminster to achieve this either. It'll be down to us. When it comes down to it, countries don't free themselves from oppression or from colonisation, not by political parties. It's very rare. And in fact, Craig Murray, who is a retired British diplomat who now fights for independence at the UN on Scotland's behalf, has said that there are several different routes we can take. He hasn't said exactly what they are, probably because we don't want the English state to know which of these various options we might use. And I think that's pretty wise because at the moment they're watching us like a hawk. I've been told by people who view this programme that it's watched by the United Kingdom government, it's watched by the Scottish government, it's watched by foreign governments as well, and it's watched by the UN, which is fascinating. I didn't even realise that. I knew that Inde-Car is viewed by people across the world, especially what's known as the diaspora. That is expatriate Scots who've migrated to other countries, settled there, and brought up new families, new generations. Now, largely the diaspora, those expatriate Scots families who moved to other countries, haven't really been brought into the campaign for independence. And this is something which Alf Baird mentions in his book, Dún Hodden, and he's also mentioned it in his public speaking. The diaspora is an essential part of any fight for independence because in a colony, many of the particularly young people are driven out of that country in search of work in other countries, something I mentioned a few minutes ago, because the opportunities aren't here in Scotland for them. And because of that, we need to engage with them. And that means that blogs like mine and blogs like Hodma Jacob with Norrie Hunter and Norrie's own programming, this needs to go to a much wider audience, which is why when I make these programs, I always ask you to share. And not only share with people here in Scotland or the UK or even in Europe, but everywhere. If you have relatives, particularly distant relatives in other places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, North America, Canada, I've already mentioned Canada, sorry, but anywhere else that you have extended family, those are the places we want you to share this message. Scotland is about to enter the final stage of its decolonisation, and that will need the support, both the moral support of the diaspora, but if possible, also the financial support of the diaspora. Because if you look at Ireland, for example, back in 1922, when it was attempting to free itself from British rule, it looked for help and for funding from Irish Americans, from Irish Canadians, and Irish descendants all across the world. And it got that support and it got that funding. And that was what helped drive the fight for independence in Ireland, and that is why there is now a Republic of Ireland, despite the fact that the United Kingdom is still clinging on to 6 counties in the northern part of the island. The bulk of Ireland was freed and is now an independent democratic republic as a result. It can be done. I know Ireland's story was not one of peaceful revolution at all, and the British state fought tooth and nail back in 1922, using force of arms where it felt like it, to try and quell that. But they were unsuccessful, and eventually Ireland, not quite reunited, but formed itself into a large and very successful European republic. And if Northern Ireland were to join it, they could also share in that success. So it's been proved it can happen. Scotland is in a situation where we're not going to be taking up arms to do this, but we will need to take to the streets eventually. Anyway, I just thought I would try and run through this and try and make some sense out of it for people who've been asking me about it. Remember, I'm not an expert on this either. I have to take my cues from people like Craig Murray, who is an ex-diplomat, retired, and is now working as an unpaid diplomat for Scotland's liberation. He has the expertise, he has the contacts, and he has met, according to his own public speaking, dozens of senior diplomats from various countries and told them about Scotland being a colony. And as he said, he was astonished to discover there was no pushback. None of these countries said, oh, but Craig, Scotland isn't a colony. It was part of the colonising of some of these other places because it went along with England on these adventures to colonise other countries. Nobody said that. They said, oh yeah, Scotland is a colony just like us. You've been through what we went through, and they recognise it. And that is interesting because they recognise it, they support our bid for liberation. And that's very important because that gets the message out to their countries as well. And that is what my message is to you today. Spread this as far across the planet as you possibly can. The viewing figures for Hodma Jacob for last week were around 2,700 views in total. But the live views were the interesting thing. The live views for last week's Hodma Jacob program were 180 live views. That's the highest we've ever had. And within an hour, we had over 1,800 accumulated views within an hour of that program going off air. So we're going to try and push the viewer numbers for Hodma Jacob into the thousands so that we can spread this news even further. So that's it from Inde-Car today. I hope you've enjoyed the content today. If you have, please like, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and tell your friends and share this as widely as you can. It all drives the algorithm and it helps me and motivates me to make more content for you. In the meantime, as I always say, keep the faith, and I'll see you next time on Inde-Car. See you soon. Bye for now.